Well, thank you for that fulsome introduction. Thank you all for coming on this glorious spring day when it feels like we should really be drinking beer on the terrace. But later, right, there's still time for that. So my thanks to the House of World Culture, and particularly to the organisers of the Anthropocene series, and to my German publisher, Meta Utopia, for making all of this happen. And my apologies for speaking in English, but I studied German in high school. You don't want to know how bad it got in the decades since. Who could have guessed, when the flood came, that it would come in slow motion, over 40 decades rather than 40 nights, as the polar ice sheets unravel and plunge into the waters? Those who have so mismanaged the fate of all things cling to their private arcs. The animals, one by one, will be saved, if at all, as gene sequences. Welcome to the time of the Anthropocene. But let's not lose ourselves to despair or fatalism. It's true enough that this civilization has ended. We live in the ruins and we know it. This way of life didn't last. But what could be a more exhilarating project than to create a new civilization? Rome wasn't unbuilt in a day. It will take time. History isn't over. It's barely begun. And where are we to find the resources of love, labour, of language to make another world? As Paolo Verno argues, it's a matter of seeing how the past is not just particular pasts, but a past reservoir of potential for love, of labour, of language in general, from which it might be possible to select different paths. The time for the eloquent exegesis of received ideas is gone. We need other pasts for other futures. There is no crisis of the humanities. There is rather a problem with humanity itself. Our species being is as builder of worlds, but we forgot how to build them, right when we need to build some other ones. Those of us whose labour and love is language, we have a lot to do. We can show how the past harbours unrealised potentials. Sometimes to take 3 steps forward, one has to take 2 steps back into the archive, that link farm of past potential. We could do with some new stories, new concepts, new affects. The Anthropocene obliges us to rethink both past and future time, and thus also to find the resources in the archive with the potential to interpret these possible temporalities. Such might be a modest contribution to the building of a survivable civilization within the ruins of this one that is passing. This is why, in Molecular Red, I went back to a largely forgotten part of the archive. It's a book that tells 2 conceptual and literary stories, and one is about the Soviet Union and the second is about the United States. It's a pair of stories about geographically very big formations whose existence in time has been brief. I don't tell the usual Cold War story about them, where one is defeated by the other. Rather, I tell a story about how the decline of one prefigures the other. The Soviet Empire, such as it was, is gone. The American one, the world empire it spawned, is on borrowed time now too. And the problem in both cases is not just the relation of an empire to rival forms of social organisation. The problem in both cases is the relation of social organisation to the nature on which it depends. If there's a central problem to creating a new civilization, a preliminary way of describing it would be to say it's about the relation between socially organised labour and nature. Now, when I say nature, the term nature has no positive content. Nature here just means that which labour encounters. What anyone imagines nature to be depends on the form of the labour within which they encounter it. Let's try to think nature in this limited and formal way for a bit, to try to sort of bracket off our assumptions about it, assumptions which probably come in any case from past ways in which social labour has encountered it, than from emerging ones. So, back into the archive. I went looking in neglected corners of an archive I know passably well, which is a Marxist and post-Marxist one. I was raised on Perry Anderson and Martin Jay and Fred Jamison's construction of a Western Marxism, and then on a series of critiques and dissents and détournements of it by feminists and anti-colonial and post-structuralist thinkers. Those critiques all develop, at least in part, out of a kind of creative use of a Marxist archival past. And there's a lot of exploring of neglected stacks at the library in that. Walter Benjamin, for example, was rescued from semi-oblivion by Hannah Arendt and others. But there's one sort of alternative fork in that archive that, with few rare exceptions, never gets taken. Nobody has that much interest in Alexander Bogdanov. In the first decade of the century, he was probably the most influential Bolshevik, more influential than Lenin. Lenin forced him out of the party, in part by attacking him on philosophical grounds. There's a famous picture of Lenin playing chess with Bogdanov while Maxim Gorky looks on. This is a version of a photo. That's one of those creepy photos where people over time have been erased from the background. Actually, not this photo, the other one you see taken from the other side. I kind of just figured this out later. But Gorky's son gets erased, for example. Like the history we're dealing with is a traumatic one. All right, so this is the famous photo. Bogdanov actually won this chess match against Lenin. According to Gorky, Lenin was a bit of a sore loser about it. But then Lenin did manage to sort of checkmate Bogdanov's influence in the Bolshevik faction and have him thrown out. So in the long run, Lenin won and, in a sense, lost everything. Bogdanov would be remembered in the Soviet Union mainly through the attacks on him in Lenin's philosophical book Materialism and Empiricriticism. Bogdanov's fate was, in some ways, even worse, officially designated as the one who had the wrong philosophy. This was a judgment that the new left actually did not think to overturn, and probably because a lot of them wanted to wrestle the mantle of Lenin from the old left. So the new left is being more Leninist than now, and didn't sort of question this previous judgment. But this sort of thing always makes me really curious. So who was this Bogdanov? What was his life and work really all about? And I don't read Russian, so it was hard for me to find out. Not much is in translation, and still less is in print. It turns out probably more in German than in English. And there's a really lovely collection of his materials you can find here at monoscope.org. And a lot of the English language materials that are available there, I take some pride in having made the PDFs and seen that they got there so that this stuff could then be studied and read and so forth. His magnificent utopian novel Red Star is freely available, fortunately. And as I say, here's the resource page, and the Historical Materialism book series is now doing English translations of his famous works, and I'm proud to be on the editorial board of that. So we're going to get Bogdanov circulating again. So why Bogdanov? Firstly, for his revival of the utopian imagination in the light of Marx, and you can find that in his novel, The Red Star. He understood the emotional power of a promised land, but unlike Gorky, he was not tempted by the idea of God building. He was more interested in opening the imaginative faculties of thinking about this world. And his utopia, even though set on Mars, is astonishingly practical. Oh, by the way, that's the Essays in Technology, which I think is his really most interesting book. There's the English edition of Red Star. Now, so that's the first reason. The second reason I think Bogdanov is interesting is because of what he called prolet cult. Bogdanov initiated a mass movement in 1917, actually even before the revolution, that tried to become a counterpower to the state, but whose mission was proletarian culture. How could the people learn to organise themselves and their world? How could the literary classics of the past, even Shakespeare, be a way of learning what organisation is, so that workers can self-organise their world? Prolet cult was about learning forms of self-organisation that can exist outside of capital and the state, and which can construct and enact a worldview based on cooperation rather than on authority or exchange value. So thirdly, his techtology. How can all organisational tasks, whether the organising of labour's relation to nature or organising of different kinds of labour with each other, share and develop knowledge? How can organisation be cooperative and collaborative rather than based on command, exchange value, or one might add now, protocol? His techtology is, I think, a kind of qualitative and experimental practice of sharing forms of engagement. It's an egalitarian approach to the formation of worldviews out of specific labours, each of which may have something to share that's of use to other particular labours. Interestingly, Bogdanov paired his critique of existing ideology with this project of producing a better one. So it's actually not all ideology critique. Part of it is, let's build better ideologies, because that's what motivates people. Yeah? Ideologies may be partly false, but they're also means of motivating labour. Some scholars think this is one of the origins of Gramsci's theory of counter-hegemony. Bogdanov thought that the October Revolution that founded the Soviet Union, that after the October Revolution that founded the Soviet Union, the real organisational work was just starting, and that the real question was labour's relation to nature. Now, we don't have the luxury of waiting till after a revolution, which maybe could never even happen, before figuring out labour's relation to nature. We sort of have to get started with that. We have to build other civilisations amid the ruination of this one. We're going to have to figure out a new relation between labour and nature, or capitalism, or whatever this mode of production is, still lumbers along, turning everything into a commodity. But I think Bogdanov is a useful guide to thinking and organising otherwise. After all, as I tried to show in Molecular Red, he almost figured out anthropogenic climate change. He already understood that organised social labour on the basis of authority and exchange alone would undermine its conditions of existence in the natural world. After his arrest and release from Lubyanka prison in the early 20s, Bogdanov withdrew from political life and devoted himself to scientific work. And I got to say that scientific work was deeply weird. It was all about blood exchange, not just blood transfusion, but exchange. If we share blood between people and we socialised it, this would be beneficial from everybody. I don't know if everybody noticed the Silicon Valley venture capitalist Peter Thiel has just proposed the opposite: one-way transfusions from young people to older people to keep them alive longer. So it's like neoliberal Bogdanov. So the scientific work is really not very scientific, but he might have actually been onto something about the usefulness of blood anyway. But it's beyond my, I'm not a hematologist. It's beyond my capabilities. All right, Bogdanov was dead by 1928 in an experiment in blood transfusion, blood exchange, just when, yeah, right, he believed in it, right? He died for his work. All right, this part's not funny. Dead in 28, just as Stalin consolidated his power, because it's pretty clear he would not have survived that era. So in Molecular Red, I wanted to call up a second witness to move us forward through the 20s and 30s. Who found a way of writing about the Soviet experiment in building a whole new mode of production, and that's Andrei Platonov, who I'm told is probably more widely available in translation in German than English, yeah? We're just starting to get some really great translations in English, but we lack one of his main work. I'll come to that. But in German, you can get them. Platonov is now fairly well known as a great modernist writer, but I think he was also a unique theorist in the Marxist tradition. And he's that rare thing, a modernist with an authentic proletarian background. His writing is a rare achievement in being almost completely untouched by the sort of the bourgeois novel. And by the way, I put up a page so you can get the one that's out of print in English, Chevenger. But if you read English, there are these actually lovely translations that you should buy because booksellers need money, right? It's like I only share the out-of-print stuff. So Platonov came up through Bogdanov's prolet cult organisation, or at least some sort of faction of it. After a promising start on a career in journalism and speculative fiction, he quit to retrain as a hydrologist and electrical engineer. He'd witnessed the famine of the early Civil War period firsthand and wanted to do something practical about it, which I really admire about him, incidentally. He worked on land reclamation and agricultural engineering until first forced out of that by some murky bureaucratic wranglings. And then he returned to writing and composed a series of masterpieces. As I read them, his famous novels or anti-novels are an alternative history of the Soviet Union. Seen from the point of view I would call history from below the below. So you guys know about history from below, right? It's my mostly English version of let's retell history from the point of view of the working people and women who are underneath the stories of the great men. Platonov doesn't do that. It's history from below the below. His characters are mostly orphans, like they're not even proletarian. They have no land, no community, no family. These books are also a profound meditation on what it means to be orphaned from the world and to be orphaned from history. In Chevengur, which many people think is his masterpiece, he writes of the Civil War and the new economic policy. In Foundation Pit, I should show you all of the titles here. In Foundation Pit, he writes of Stalin's forced collectivization of agriculture, to which he was one of the few writers who was a first-hand witness. In Happy Moscow, he writes of the urban elites of the mid-30s, and in Soul, he travels to the far west and produces a powerful allegory on leadership and communal self-determination set within a world of harsh and unforgiving nature. Needless to say, none of these books were published in his lifetimes. Among other things, I think Platonov deepens Bogdanov's commitment to thinking and writing from the labour point of view, including a kind of sub-proletarian one. He writes of the struggle of labour against an impoverished nature, trying to build the foundation on which the exalted superstructures of this new civilization were supposed to be based. He writes of what Sartre called the practico-inert, the recalcitrant world, partly of our own making, that disorganises our labours and reduces us to passivity. There's no leaping over practicalities into the sort of communist future in Platonov. And for him, we can only ever be comrades if we face the same dangers. Far from being parodies of Soviet speak, the sort of Marxicological language his characters often use, I think, is kind of in earnest. He sort of over-identifies with Marxist concepts in order to hold to account the state which can merely mouth them. And this is not the standard reading of Platonov, I don't think, so that's my particular take on him. So in sum, Bogdanov teaches us how to think from the labour point of view about the problem of organising social labour's relation in and against nature. And Platonov teaches us just how resistant and recalcitrant nature is, how the struggle to organise life can fail, and how it's only when we are all comrades, all facing the same danger, that the struggle in and against nature has a chance. The difference in their worldviews comes in part from different forms of organising labour that they practiced. Both were participant observers of Soviet civilization, such as it was, which tried to organise nature and labour by commanding it and fails in the attempt. So that's the first half of Molecular Red. The second half is about America, more specifically about California in the post-war era. It's not a story of famine, but of relentless plenty. Although these days it has to be said that behind the fantasy of sun and silicon, we see ever more clearly the shortage of water and the plenitude of prisons. So who are the theorists and writers who help us see beyond what Mark Fisher diagnosed as capitalist realism in the way Platonov showed us beyond socialist realism? In the second half of Molecular Red, I look firstly to Donna Haraway and what she would call her messmates, and then to the science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson. Haraway is a kind of archetypal product of the military-industrial complex at its peak, on her own account. The Cold War effort against the Soviets drew women into the ranks of the scientifically trained. Just as Bogdanov started in medical science, before becoming a theorist, she started in biology. Her first book is on the organicist school of biology, which has a certain affinity with Bogdanov, it turns out. She writes there about Joseph Needham, for example, whose approach drew in part on the systems theory of Ludwig Bertalanffy, which in turn bears a striking resemblance to Bogdanov's techtology, even though he never cites it. Giulia, who knows a bit more about this than I do, is saying, yeah, he stole this from Bogdanov. I can say that now, right? Yeah, stole it from Bogdanov. Right, but she's the scholar who knows these things. I'm just sort of trying to create a frame for thinking about all this. All right, so like Bogdanov, Haraway is useful for thinking through the Anthropocene because she's actually not a social constructivist, even though she's sometimes assimilated into that school. For both Bogdanov and Haraway, science at one and the same time produces verifiable knowledge of that alien, inhuman world called nature, and yet is also saturated in metaphors imported from existing historical organisation of labour and life. The difficulty is keeping those two ideas in one's head at the same time and not collapsing back into either the faith in a sort of metaphysical realism, that's a sort of endemic worldview of the science trained, or a faith in a sort of metaphysical nominalism and social constructivism, that's the sort of endemic worldview to the humanities and the social science trained. For those of us who are humanities or social science trained and who are not yet ready to give up certain ingrained habits of thought, let me just put this in tactical terms. The absolutist critique of science is now ideologically a weapon of the far right. It's the far right who deny climate science, surely one of the most important advances in knowledge of the late 20th century. So I think it really would be a good idea to stop giving any intellectual cover to climate scientists, climate denialists and their kin, all right? And this, I put these slides together. This is a year old. Things have gotten worse. There's basically a McCarthyite witch hunt going on in the American Congress to frustrate government-funded science, not just in climate science, but in any environmental field at all. So I really feel like solidarity with our colleagues and comrades in the sciences is very, very important if you're a humanities scholar, or really just believe in knowledge and its role in the world. All right, so both Bogdanov and Haraway are nevertheless proponents of a more specific critique within the sciences, right? So it's not like we have to give up, thinking might be certain problems with science. In Bogdanov, it has to do with how metaphors form the social organisation of labour, from the social organisation of labour, find their way into scientific worldviews, even when the science it produces is verifiable. Basic metaphors drawn from authoritarian social relations and market exchange relations both enable but also limit scientific practice. A common everyday example, I don't know if you say this in German, but in English, like a beehive has a queen and drones. So it's like, I don't think bees know anything about feudalism, right? It's actually not feudalism that's going on there. We've imported from a form of social organisation, something that sort of doesn't belong there. It's perhaps unavoidable, but one needs to kind of know the implications and limits of metaphors when you use them. A more provocative one would be to suggest maybe there's a kind of a problem in thinking ecology as a self-correcting homeostasis that returns to equilibrium, because that's Adam Smith's notion of the market, yeah? That probably originally came from understandings of geology. So that's a metaphor. Like maybe it doesn't always, maybe it's not homeostatic, right? Maybe that's what the Anthropocene's about. Nature's not always homeostatic. So one has to sort of think about where the metaphors come from, and that metaphors are kind of a limit and a problem without thinking that, oh, look, a metaphor's been imported to science, therefore all of science is invalid. Like that is just really taking that way too far. And that's the danger zone we've entered into now, I think, with the critique of science from the right. Anyway, so end of the sermon part. All right, so Bogdanov's whole project was to rethink science and labour together as cooperative practices without reducing them to exchange or authority. Haraway does something I think is analogous. She famously untangles metaphors of gender, sexuality and race in the life sciences. What's less well known is her Marxist side. She extends the Marxian category of fetishism from commodity fetishism to code fetishism. In our times, the world appears not just as a vast accumulation of commodities or spectacles, but also as a vast accumulation of codes or algorithms, as if everything was run by software command. And her whole body of work is pitched against the code fetishism of genetics, for example, in favour of an organicist biology that saw code as an aspect of how bodies are organised, but not its commander. Haraway also usefully complicates Bogdanov's labour point of view, most famously in her Cyborg Manifesto, or Manifesto for Cyborgs. Bogdanov falls prey to a kind of fetishism himself in trying to think labour as if it were not always already entangled in an apparatus. Haraway's cyborg figure is a way of complicating what labour might be, introducing complexities not just about how bodies are raced and gendered, but how they're woven out of flesh and code and metal and pharmaceuticals and so much more. The cyborg is all of us. One can't separate living labour from the cyborg mesh. A consequence of this line of thought is that nature is something that can only appear as that which resists labour, including scientific labour, but that labour is always mediated by some kind of apparatus. Our knowledge is cyborg knowledge. In Molecular Ed, I follow this through the works of two people who are close to Haraway. Karen Barad restates something like Bogdanov's philosophy of science for the era of contemporary physics. Paul Edwards looks closely at the cyborg apparatus it took to produce climate science in the first place. I take the ability to say something useful about climate science to be the litmus test for any theory today. Yes, I'm in the bookstore, I'm looking at the back covers, at the famous philosophers. It's like, do they get it? No, not going to read that book. Yeah? It's like at some point one has to sort of start looking. Who gets it? Who gets what happened in the world? Clearly, many of our favourites from the archive seem also to sort of fail that kind of test, given how much of the work of their Epigones marches on as if the Earth were still flat, or the same thing was not the object of an anthropogenic effect with the capacity to crash it. Now, Paul Edwards, who was Haraway's student, provides in his book A Vast Machine a really useful reading of climate science as something that arose out of three things. The deployment of an apparatus that was largely military in origin, such as computers and satellites, but which also required advances in mathematical physics and, perhaps most important, a culture of international scientific collaboration and cooperation. Ironically enough, the kind of self-organised, collaborative love of labour that is scientific and that Bogdanov put such trust in was the very thing that produced this most useful, mission-critical knowledge about nature, climate science. It partly derives from the military, but partly derives from the kind of collaborative practice Bogdanov was talking about. There's been a revival of interest in things to do with objects and even materialism of late. But in Molecular Ed, I show why I think some of these miss the mark. Firstly, any theory that does not get some notion of the Anthropocene quickly yet efficiently, yet critically, seems to me not to be doing the job of thinking the times. And this is why I find some of the new materialisms of the vibrating, the vital, or of the void just like a little bit off topic. Secondly, there seems to be a tendency in them to reinstate philosophy as first philosophy, as legislating for what matters, as if high theory still had the authority to do such a thing. What I find more useful is the kind of low theory or collaborative practice, a techtology that Bogdanov and in her own way Haraway were working on, a kind of interstitial rather than dominant role for theory. They're about porting metaphors between labours of knowing, where concepts are selected and tested in each field, rather than legislating from a centralised philosophical party. They aren't short a kind of organisational work or cooperative systems practice. It's really hard to find a stock photograph for collaborative labour. Like, that's really a problem. Like, Google collaborative labour image and you don't get anything interesting. So I'm sorry this picture is all men, but Jules Dassin, who came to Europe because of the blacklist, couldn't make movies in America. Rififi is a film noir crossed with a robbery caper movie, but where these professional thieves collaborate to steal the jewels is the most beautiful 10 minutes of a film about collaboration you ever saw. And these guys don't even all speak the same language, but boy can they steal jewels, right? So it's kind of no accident that Dusan was a Hollywood leftist. Like, collaboration and labour is what cinema's all about. So it's just like a little side note here that it's hard to even picture what collaboration is supposed to be about. So that's why I got this picture for you. Now, this, I think, is the task for the theoretically minded today. Not to issue edicts from what we imagine on high to be the state of the world. Nobody much cares about our grand pronouncements anyway. Rather, is to create interstitial communications, to get percepts, concepts, and affects to move between fields, to propose things from one field that might be useful to another, always bearing in mind that it is not theory that legislates on what is and what isn't for all fields. Rather, each field of knowledge is its own keeper of the protocols of such decisions. And then one can also ask questions about these metaphors of legislating and protocols, right? So, again, for those for whom this is not theoretically satisfying, consider it as a practical matter. Nobody is ever going to agree on a particular philosophy, new materialist or otherwise. So why hold up the urgent work of building a new civilization for what would be an endless debate about first principles? In any case, for those of us with a Marxist bent, such concepts arise out of practice, not the other way around. And again, I couldn't find the picture, so here's another great European movie that's got images about different points of view. As I was writing Molecular Red, I took a break to waste some time on social media. And there in my feed, it just lit up with a story about US Senator James Inhofe of Oklahoma using a snowball to disprove the scientific and anthropogenic global warming. Global warming being what the right wing wants to call it, because that sounds great. Yeah, it's warm today. Global warming feels great. I think we've got to start calling it climate disruption, right? Now, this guy was at the time chair of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, right? And is a denialist. As we saw in the last presidential election, it would seem that the United States has some sort of death wish, a fanaticism that wills it towards extinction. If hard-won scientific knowledge about nature appears to set limits on the endless commodification of everything, then the sock puppets of the commodifiers will take to their bully pulpits to declare that the Earth is flat. And I've got to say, Europe might not be immune to that particular tendency. So it's time to all make our own versions of this sign and get out there. So to some extent, we're on our own. We have to build a new civilization, one that maybe won't quite look like this. We have to build a new civilization in the pores of the old one and maybe do it on the quiet. Maybe we could just do our modest bit to try out percepts, affects, and concepts that might be useful. Can we actually perceive what's really on the agenda for history? Can we generate useful ways of feeling about situations and their actual possibilities? Can we organize perception and affect in useful and open-ended but not too open-ended ways? Such might be the rudiments of a low theory or a techtology for today. Now, while Haraway's work is rich in material from science fiction, and the Manifesto for Cyborgs was intentionally constructed as a political myth, perhaps there's a need for a more extensive practice of imagining other worlds. And this is why I end Molecular Red with the work of Kim Stanley Robinson. Anybody read the famous Mars trilogy? No. Well, we got one person. Read some KSR. There's new book called Aurora, which is probably a better place to start because the Mars trilogy is long. Read Aurora, or this one called 2312, which I highly recommend. Like kind of what used to be called hard science fiction, right? So that gets the science right, but kind of imagining possibilities for the human within that space. But I wrote about Mars Trilogy in Molecular Red because it's a sort of self-conscious updating of Bogdanov's Red Star. Maybe not an accident. Robinson was once actually a student of Frederick Jamison, so his novels offer particular delights for those who know their Western Marxism, even though they're kind of aimed at a general readership. Like Bogdanov, Robinson builds a socialist utopia on Mars. What makes it different to Bogdanov and more of a piece with our times is that Robinson imagines more of what you might call a meta utopia. Robinson's task is not to advocate one organisational form, but to show how all of them might negotiate with each other. He actually even writes an imaginary constitution for Mars after the revolution, right? And it's not there's one way of doing things, it's about here's how we negotiate between different versions of the good life. So he does in utopian fiction something equivalent to what I'm calling low theory. Negotiate between different kinds of labour and the worldviews that they generate. And nothing I love, he's called Stan in real life. Nothing I love about Stan, he's the only Californian I know who's written a book about New York, my hometown, in the future where he didn't destroy it. Right? Every Hollywood movie about New York in the future, they frickin' destroy us. It's like, why do you hate us? Stan didn't do that. His New York is lovely because we endure with great difficulty. That's what it looks like, the cover. So I may have lost some people here with the mere mention of the word utopia, but I don't see utopias as ideal or perfect or imaginary or hopeful or unrealistic. If you want unrealistic worlds, try the bourgeois novel. Compare Stendhal to Charles Fourier. It's the utopian Fourier who thinks about who takes out the trash, right? There's a whole chapter in Fourier's about, like, the shit, who deals with that? Like, he has an answer, yeah? Like, there's nothing about that in Jane Austen, yeah? Or the novel doesn't deal with reality in that sense. Utopias do. That's the paradoxical thought I want to leave you with here. So I'd see utopias as intensely practical, actually as the practical taken to extremes. Using the estrangement effect of setting the action on Mars, Robinson, like Bogdanov, asked practical questions about how to organise labour, including scientific and technical labour, where the production of exchange value does not determine use value anymore. Because if you want a totally unreal fantasy world, it's the one we actually imagine we're in. It has already ceased to exist, yeah? We're living in a world that's not real. We just don't quite realise it yet. We're already in the next act of trying to build another world. So my modest proposal is to use the university and adjacent institutions, such as this one, as a place to experiment with forms of collaborative world-making, with systems, practices, with low theories, with technologies, call it what you like. This does not even have to be about the Anthropocene, because it gets depressing after a while, right? The Anthropocene shapes the agenda for knowledge, but the agenda need not be obsessively about it, which is why I called molecular red theory for the Anthropocene, not of, yeah? At some point it's like, all right, we know what the agenda is, let's get on with our other tasks. So what resources can we pull from the archive that might usefully contribute labour in and against nature, to labour in and against nature, which do not completely dominate through forms of control, through forms of exchange value? What ways can those of us who practice the language arts contribute to the interpretive and translation problems between all of the other kinds of labour that it takes to make a world? In molecular red, I was interested in how the Anthropocene might approach the archive differently. I guess, can we have a different relation to the archive? Yeah, I was sort of like taking a dive into the past time. And I'll just conclude with a brief word about a more recent book, which is General Intellects. So molecular red sort of takes the long view, long historical times, going back a century. General Intellects sort of takes the broad view, sort of across contemporary theoretical practices. The 21 pieces that make up this book move from political economy to political theory to cultural studies, media studies, science studies. It moves across fields looking for ways to port metaphors from one domain of knowledge production to another without making any of them primary. So I refuse to treat philosophy or political economy or any other field as sovereign. Rather, I try to get them to cooperate. And this is actually the hardest thing about working between the so-called different disciplines. And this, I think, is quite different to the interdisciplinary, which mostly is about sort of staking out separate fields of sovereignty by vigilantly policing the borders. I don't think that will work anymore. The Anthropocene obliges us to organise knowledge differently. It's probably not helpful to think of this as a crisis, as crisis signals as sort of effective responses of panic and helplessness, not to mention offering an opening for all kinds of authoritarians, offering false comforts. Rather, I think it's best to just coolly keep working, but to organise our work differently. Let's work collaboratively on building a new civilization here in the ruins of the old one. You don't have to look far to see the certain rather forward-thinking members of the ruling class are indeed building their own private arks. They've decided to be traitors to our species being. They've decided to loot what they can from this civilization based on the application of intensive information-based management to the command and control of nature and labourers' resources, measured only in exchange value. They know it can't last. Luxury survivalism is now a market niche. They're building private armies or bunkers in New Zealand or dreaming of space, but where they get to go to space without us. So it might be timely to start work on Plan B for the 99%. And those of us who've led comfortable lives here in the overdeveloped world should make no mistake about this. As far as the current ruling class is concerned, we're part of the disposable 99%. We too are surplus population. If you want a fictional space in which to explore how this might feel, I really recommend, anyone read William Gibson's The Peripheral? Super recommend this one. It sort of gets the affect and the tone of the moment. What's peripheral to the ruling class of today is us. So let's come up with another plan and another practice for living and loving and working. Let's build a new civilization. Does that sound like fun? Yeah, let's do it. That's all I got. Thank you.
I'm very, I'm enjoying it really, really much. And there are a lot of things that I would like to ask you. But let me start with a very simple one. Why did you become interested in these Russian figures, in these forgotten sources? I think that they are kind of neglected in literature. And when people always ask me why I did my dissertation on Alexander Bogdanov, and I wanted to actually tell more stories, not just the Western one. I was investigating the history of systems thinking and cybernetic, and I thought, okay, I have to explore in the archives. I have to look at this work, technology, the general science of organization, because actually it anticipated the general systems theory. So I do have an answer when someone asks me why I became crazy about these authors. What about you? Because it seems to me, it's easy to, I can imagine, it's not difficult to develop an interest in Donna Haraway or Kim Stanley Robinson, but it's not so obvious to develop an interest in this maverick authors. Why that?
Well, there's always too many answers to that question, and none of them are ever really true. I think the honest answer any author would give you is, I don't know. Yeah. But I can, retrospectively think of some threads. I'm from media studies, so we had to figure out what computation was. So computation takes you back through the history of systems theory, because those things are connected. So that's one story. I was like a teenage militant. Like I was trained by the labour movement. My first teachers were real organic intellectuals of organised labour, and I was like fairly useless at the sort of things they had to do, like being on picket lines and so forth. So I minded the library, and I randomly read stuff in the library. The scariest experience was getting a 2-volume Lenin and reading it through and finding pages covered over. Like there was a page where half the page was covered over, right? So it's like, between this being published and released, someone became a non-person. Yeah? Like this is the history of Stalinism. It's like someone, and literally every single copy of this book, someone's become a non-person. So I kind of got interested in non-people. And Bogdanov's one of the big ones, because he's a non-person before the Bolsheviks even win. So there was that. And one of the books I found in that library is Bogdanov's Political Economy was translated by the British Communist Party and used as a training manual in the 1920s. Right? Because there wasn't an official Marxism-Leninism in the early 1920s. So the parties did all sorts of crazy, weird stuff. And in fact, early British Marxism is all about, it's mostly all about Bukharin. Yeah. But there's a big chunk of Bogdanov in there as well. So I was just like, this was decades ago, but I had this little weird sense that there's some other little pocket over there. And then discovering that Bogdanov was thinking about, it's not quite anthropogenic climate change in Red Star because they're Martians. Yeah. It's Martianogenic climate change. So he has a utopia that's like a utopia you would write after Darwin, right? Where you don't fix everything for all time. There's a constant struggle. So he kind of got it in 1908, yeah? And then I read in the Techtology, he sort of gets this thing about atmospheric physics of carbon.
Yeah.
Like he never quite connects these things together, but he sort of got it. Like he got biosphere. So I thought, I'm doing research on Marxists because those are my people. Like still, yeah, I feel a certain loyalty to the militants who trained me.
So,
that's where I got Bogdanov.
It wasn't the general science of organization, the Techtology, I mean, that you read first. It was political...
it was the political economy, which is not quite as orthodox as... Like, it's interestingly weird too, but that's another story.
I was impressed by the main statement of your book. So, namely that we need new narratives and new theories because, I mean, we are in presence of new facts. So this means that current narratives are not able actually to solve the challenges that the Anthropocene poses us. I was thinking, while I was thinking about that, it came into my mind that even Immanuel Wallerstein, for instance, he has a very, he took it really right when he said that even anti-systemic movements and popular resistance actually do not provide alternative to the system, but they actually serve to reinforce the capitalist system. And so I thought maybe this is the case with Platonov and Bogdanov. But as you said in the book, they are facing the tragedy of their times, and they're kind of proposing new narratives, new models. We see the organization of knowledge put forward in technology to solve the situation of their time. But actually, they didn't make it. They didn't survive throughout the course of the history. So how can we expect not to fail by recovering and unveiling these sources and use them to overcome the Anthropocene?
I mean, I think if you start with this premise that, and to you, the category civilization is a somewhat loaded one, and which one could talk about that. But, the civilization we're in, like, its days are numbered and we know it, right? Everyone knows it. There's just a kind of a public disavowal of this fact. Like, this one's not going to work out.
Yeah.
It needs modification, at the very least. So it seems to me, rather than read the people who celebrated how awesome it was, like, that's not very helpful. Let's read people who tried another civilization and failed at it and knew it. Like, that seems to be like, those are our people. That's who we need to know. Bogdanov is already a critic of, sotto voce of the Soviet Union in 1917, right? Like the militarizing of the party in the Civil War, Bogdanov thinks is the opposite of what organization should be about. And he's a kind of loyal opposition figure. But Platonov is just there, like he's there on the ground. Like he lived through the Civil War. He lived through NEP. Like he saw what forced collectivization was like. And, it kind of destroys his mind and he reorganizes language and writes about it. And I just think those Platonov anti-novels are masterpieces of the 20th century that everyone should know about. Yeah? They really should be part of world literature.
Yeah.
But I think and I'm not a Russian scholar, I'm not even a literature person, but the thing I can read in it that I think even his translators sometimes miss is he was a Marxist. Like, he really was. Like, he's a believer. Like, I recognize my people when I see them, right? He's like, oh, comrade, I see what you're doing here. Like, and he's surrounded by literally this noise of Marxological language that's on the radio, for example, and in the newspapers, and he sort of, it's a détournement of that, and he kind of explains the disaster in its own language as a peasant would or as a semi-educated worker would. Like, it's just, like, that's the voice you need to hear, yeah? So it's not, you can read Trotsky saying from on high in the 20s about what may or may not be going on, but here's your man on the ground, like, saying, here's what we heard, here's what we did, and here is how hard it is. Like the fancy dreams of the gleaming superstructures, underneath that is someone with their feet in the shed trying to make it work. And he's that person. So, yeah, I think moments of historical change require rethinking what the archive is that matters.
Yeah.
It's not just reinterpreting the people we think are there forever. We need new pasts.
And maybe we need to look at the way losers taught about history.
Yeah.
We need new histories. I mean new stories about the history, because I was thinking of what Marx wrote about the fact that great personages, great figures happen in history twice. The first time, as a tragedy, and the second time as a farce. And we are not, of course, dealing with great figures. We are dealing with known people. I think
it's got to be a three-part joke now. It's like first time is tragedies, second time is farce, third time is just memes. The third one's even worse. The second one at least seemed to make sense. Yeah.
So we need, obviously,
new ancestors. It's a paradoxical word, right? But we need new ancestors because, the ancestors we've been using are late Holocene thinkers.
Yeah.
They're thinkers who, for example, thought you could bracket off the social from the natural, and that wouldn't be a problem because there's some stable relationship between them.
Yeah.
None of that's any help. The foundation of social science is that in a lot of ways, and it's no longer any help.
Yeah.
So
I really think it makes sense to give space and brings to light forgotten sources and forgotten authors. We are actually pursuing a project, a research project at our institute about opening, enriching our narratives of the Anthropocene and for the Anthropocene by looking at the work of people who, at fringe of current scientific literature. So that's why I was insisting on this point. So, Ken, when we talk about this Gestalt shock, this paradigm shift that we need to get out of this terrible situation, do you think this can happen through a kind of reshaping our knowledge in a gradual way, progressively, and so making use of existing knowledge, which actually brought to the point we are and actually allowed us to identify the Anthropocene? Or you think, following Bogdanov and Russian Bolshevist revolutionaries, we really need to cut with all existing knowledges to produce, a revolutionary momentum in order to get out of this period and go ahead and go forward?
I don't know. No one does. Because, right? It's a moment that's historically unprecedented, but here's the other shoe dropping, right? It's geologically unprecedented. What does it mean to be in a geologically unprecedented moment? We don't really have the intellectual tools to deal with that. So I think it would be kind of like false advice to say, yes, we should follow this strategy. It's I have no idea. Let's try all of it. You have to try everything. Yeah?
No, because I was thinking of evolution, how the evolution works and how biological species evolve. Stephen Jay Gould told us that the evolution occurs, through punctuated equilibrium. So why this has to be different with society? We really need to get rid of old infrastructures, of old institutions, to update our culture. Even Antonio Gramsci, you mentioned some positions of some Western Marxists. Even Antonio Gramsci believed that a revolutionary change would occur with a cultural change that has to pass through a cultural change. And I'm really insisting on that because I really think we need to get over somehow. Well, this is actually very difficult.
Yeah,
we cannot compare.
I've sort of gone back to my more vulgar Marxist roots.
Yeah.
And the dominant sort of critique of vulgar Marxism is it's all about prioritizing the relations of production. I actually want to be even more vulgar than that and prioritize the forces of production and sort of think through how transformations in the forces of production changed not only forms of economic organization, but cultural habits and cultural metaphors in ways we haven't really quite processed. So this is just not the capitalism of the 1850s.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I haven't seen a steam engine in the last decade run anything. Yeah, they're just not there. It's something else, and it's not just that the commodity form got extended to incorporate more things and to include information. It's that those things have changed the commodity form as well. So I think one kind of needs a fresh language to think through whatever this mode of production actually even is. But I would do it in sort of a vulgar way of starting with, forces of production are different. And they're the things one tends to bracket off and not sort of pay attention to. So I'd want to press on that a little more rather than I'm a recovering Gramscian. You know, I'm from the 80s, man. Like in the Anglophone world, like we Gramsci'd hard at that time. So I've sort of like moved back away from that because we thought we could advance in the cultural sphere independently of what happened below in the classic metaphor. And I'm a little more skeptical about that. But to go so as to not contradict the earlier answer, let's do everything at once. So, like, by all means, let's like sort of press on with, you know, the construction of new forms of life, some of which will prioritize the formation of a philosophy. Like, is there an appropriate philosophy for the times? Yeah? Or philosophies plural. Like, that's an important thing to be working on. And it might be more important to conduct the parallel experiments than to always be like arguing with each other, you know. And it's like, thank God we didn't start this with like, let's not call it the Anthropocene, let's call it something else.
The Capitalocene or
like, I don't care, call it whatever you like, right? Just acknowledge something's happening.
Yeah.
It's just not interesting. Like it really is like the first pass thing we have to get beyond.
Absolutely. As far as we know it, we realize that the Anthropocene is something culturally rooted, not just, we can, I mean, we have to think about it in cultural terms, using the most diverse forms of knowledge. And so I don't think that the idea that the Anthropocene is rising out of capitalism would help us. I mean, fighting capitalism. We need something more.
Well, they're both equally useful. Like the Capitalocene people are like onto something, and it works and it explains certain things, but it has certain limits because you reduce yourself to thinking about capitalism. And yes, there is a bit of a problem with making anthropos the central figure, but it's actually not quite what you think it is when you make that critique. And it's a really useful word to have in your lexicon if you want to talk to earth scientists, because that's how they're talking about it. So it's like, oh, okay, I'll speak the language you guys are using. They're not all agreed on it, obviously, but that's how you speak there. And then I have people who want to talk about the Capitalocene, and then there's the 1,000 Names of Gaia people over there, slightly more romantic. All right, whatever works for you. And it's like parts of the puzzle.
It's so complex, I mean, as a concept.
Yeah, but let's not try and have intellectual arguments about which is better. Let's think about it, you know, like sociologically. How do you process this historical moment in a different language in different communities and keep them in dialogue? Like that's the politics of knowledge now.
I think that a central category in your book and in your work actually is the notion of labor. Labor is really, I mean, I would like you to a little bit expand on that. I mean, I was thinking that all problems arising out of the Anthropocene are related somehow in the first place with labor. I'm thinking of trade, market, development issues, sustainability, or global inequalities between global South and global North, in the West during Cold War, and blah, blah, blah. And I was thinking that there is an Ukrainian physician, Sergei Podolinsky, who tried to update the theory of Marx, the theory of labor of Marx, with an account on thermodynamics, entropy. He believes that all the energy that we receive from the sun has to be maximized on Earth to produce new labor in order not to dissipate this energy. So labor seems to be about labor again. This is really... I wanted to ask you, having in mind that Bogdanov thinks that labor is a means through which organize nature and to which organize the world, how can we reshape the relationship between man and humanity and nature through organization and labor, having in mind an extended framework, an extended definition of labor that, as you explained very well in your book, now includes digital labels, for instance, which is kind of separating us from nature. I mean, this is a barrier in a way. Because,
all right, there's a few things there.
Yeah.
There may be a little inconsistency in how Marx thinks about labor. And there's a kind of Hegelian view of labor as spirit infusing itself in the world. But I think Marx also starts to think labor through thermodynamics. And his relation to Hegel is much more studied than his relation to the scientific materialism of the post-1948 moment. And that's really kind of more interesting. Like Marx starts to think, oh, labor is part of a thermodynamic model of how the world works. Yeah. Now, he's a little inconsistent about this, and he still wants to make human labor a slightly separate thing from other kinds of energy. It has a certain separate quality. In some ways, that's kind of not going to work. It is part of the same, if you're a consistent monist, you know, labor's another kind of energy. There's lots of kinds of energy. They're all the same thing. You would want to sort of push back on that. However, and this, I think, is Bogdanov's whole relationship to Marx, is to say the central thing in Marx is not dialectical materialism or anything like that. It's the labor point of view. Marx thinks from the labor point of view. Bogdanov goes as far as to say the working class wrote Das Kapital. Marx was the stenographer. Yeah? Like the book is the product of a movement. So it's a version of a standpoint theory, in a sense. So, and to me, that's one element not to lose sight of. From what point of view are you trying to view the world? You're not really viewing it from a universal, placeless, objective point. Let's kind of adhere to a point of view here. So in that sense, I stick with Marx and Bogdanov. I work for a living. I always have. I always will. I'm one of those who work. I believe in the fraternity or sorority of all of those who work. A lot of those who work aren't human anymore. Like, that has to be dealt with. That which labours includes other species. It includes technologies. Someone has to think labour in a much broader way. But keeping the human point of view in the centre of it, but without thinking it special anymore. One has to sort of, it is my point of view because that's who I am, but it's not necessarily a special kind of labour. And yeah, it turns out that view of planet-wide energy system, that's now like a legitimate science. Like Vaclav Smil will give you an estimate for how much of photosynthesis on the planet is for human use, 20%. Right? So it's like, this is legitimate science. Now, they're estimates, and he gives you all of the reasons our estimates of this are shaky. And that should give us pause, right? That we actually can't quantify human use of energy on the planet well is already a problem. Yeah? But that seems to me to be a useful point of view to further develop, and that it partly has Marxist roots as a thing sort of not to lose sight of, even though Schmill would not identify with that point of view at all. So it's to sort of keep two things in mind. One, that, labour's in some ways maybe not special. It's part of a global energy system. Yeah. On the other hand, it's what I am. It's my point of view. So it's keeping those two ideas together.
But what I found very interesting is the way you expanded the notion of labor to include scientific labor, academic labor, artistic labor, and precarious labor, and even non-labor. This is very interesting to me, because when I think of Bogdanov and the way he conceives labor, there is always an activity, an active behavior that aims at grasping a fact of nature. But where we are in presence of digital labor, for instance, and we lose contact with nature, how can think about labor? To organize nature, or new forms of organizing nature without active labor.
And one can see how something like what Haraway calls like a code fetishism. Yeah. When your relation to nature is kind of mediated by a whole apparatus of extracting numerical values from it, and you're working, in fact, only on the numerical values and not even seeing the organisms that it comes from, right? Because someone else does that. That's just grunt work for grad students or whatever, not even, so you can sort of fetishize this and think code is everything. Which is a little bit where we are now, like algorithms run the world. Yeah. And it's partly true. The thing about any fetish is it's always partly true, right? Algorithms are powerful things in the world. But they only run if you've got a computer under them and a huge energy source that runs the computer, right? So it's to get out of the fetishistic view of it and to see all of those things as connected to labour. Maybe labour is too big a category also. The fact that commodification now works on non-labour in a new way, like it always did. So work women did in the home in your classic nuclearised, sort of developed world, that's non-labour. That's work, right? It's effort, but it's not labour in the sense of belonging directly to the commodified system. But that category is like vastly expanded. So basically every time you open your laptop to entertain yourself, you're performing free labor for someone else, right? For Google or for Apple or whoever. I met a grad student once who was working on something else, but he talked about doing work on streaming. Like we think of, I don't know if you say this in German or something like it, but streaming is like, I'm just streaming a TV show. right? I'm streaming it to me. It's like, no, you're streaming your data to them. Yeah, you got to think a stream that works both ways at the same time. Where the one that matters is it's streaming away from you. Yeah?
Like Bogdanov's transfusion, blood transfusion.
Oh yeah. Well, in terms of it was not science what he did, right? This has to be said at the outset. But the metaphors he's playing with, he was sort of onto something about sharing and reciprocity in an interesting, weird way. Yeah. So labour, but to think it in a much more expanded way, and then maybe to look at the internal differences within it.
Oh, yeah. Well, let me go then to the last questions. Oh, Ken. I had like other 3 pages. I told you at the beginning that I wanted to ask you so many things.
I was so scared because she really knows this stuff. Like, she's a real student of it. I just wrote a book about it because I thought it was interesting, you know. Okay,
this is, it's the most interesting one. No, well, how would you imagine a technology in the 21st century? How do you imagine, would you imagine the product cult of the 21st century? And if you can share with us any experiences, practical experiences you have been part of, you have participated in, that resemble some kind of this association nowadays, of course. Because I have the impression that these attempts, these experiments, even the Capri School, this laboratory of knowledge, were very local. And I don't think, very local and run by an elite, very aristocratic, I would say, even though we're dealing with Marxists, heretic Marxists. So how would you imagine such an association today working on a global scale? Because we have so many problems in this world. This world is split. We have fights among states ongoing. Every single day we have problems. We have even Trump, who denies the climate change, although his chief Bannon helped to build the biosphere too. So this is really odd.
Another story. Yeah.
Oh my God! And if you think that maybe the hyperreal world on the web could help us in managing something like that on a global scale, because I'm actually a little bit disillusioned by that. I think that the web has failed in many points. I was thinking of what Dan Schiller called digital capitalism, who causes even more inequalities. In the social context. Or even the way we produce our work in the academic world, even the way we used to organize knowledge through social media, such as, for instance, Academia Edu or ResearchGate. I was reading what Alessandro Del Fanti says about this. They are financial market of ideas. So, even the web needs new forms of organization. What's your opinion about that? I'm very curious.
Yeah, I had a second life as a militant, which was in the sort of avant-gardes around internet in the 80s and the 90s, and I think we won the battle and then lost the war. Everything we tried to build, the Transmediale, which is held here every other year as part of that whole legacy. Everything we tried to build got co-opted and commodified. So we fought the good fight. But look, any margin of autonomy or liberty that individual users still have has got to do with those social movements resisting things. So like technologies don't just build themselves automatically; they're fields of struggle between different forces. All right, and there's a few pieces to this. And one would be, I don't want to call it capitalism with a modifier. So my provocation to you is this. What if this is not capitalism anymore, but something worse? Right? What if this is a new mode of production? What would be the conditions of possibility for making that case? That seems to me to be a debate that really needs to happen. And I'm always told repeatedly when I do this why it must still be capitalism. Because apparently capitalism is eternal. Right? It's an essence that has only appearances that change. And those are signalled by sticking a new modifier on it. Some of which, let's face it, actually make no sense. How can you call it neoliberal capitalism? Even your modifier's got a modifier. I'm sorry, I deal with language. When you start abusing language like this, then clearly there's no concept there at the root of it. It doesn't work. So, and since we're short on time, I'm going to really shorthand this one. There's already been 2 modes of production based on commodification. The first was the landlord system. In Germany, it was the Juncker system. capitalist class fought them and was opposed to them and had to abolish them, right? Same thing in England, only it happened earlier. Ricardo, one of Marx's sources, it's about the struggle between capital and not labour, but landlords. You can have multiple ruling classes based on multiple forms of commodified mode of production at the same time. So what if there was landlordism, capitalism? There's various radically non-standard versions of both of those if you start looking in the rest of the world, right? That's the provincial European version, that there was two. There's already multiple. What if there's a new one? What if there's something after capitalism that's worse, and it's based on the commodification of information, which changes what the commodity form is and how surplus is extracted and how power is maintained. So in other words, we confront something for which we don't yet have a language. We keep using this old language and sticking modifiers on the front of it as if it's just a new appearance of the old thing. What if it's not? Marx didn't do that. Marx came up with a new language to describe a new phenomena in the world. That's our task now. Yeah? Yeah. So that's the first thing. It ain't capitalism, it's worse. So there are a lot of, it's not capitalism, it's better stories, like the post-industrial and the third way. I'm not doing that. So it's worse, it's not better. But it's not quite capitalism, so we need a new language. It works in a different way. How surplus is extracted is different. So the sites of struggle are different, the forms of struggle are different, the language of struggle will be different, right? So I refuse to work on May Day and go join the general strike in New York City with 200 other people, because most people don't know what that means anymore. It's a language from another era that's very dear to me, but it's not like I'm going to make the world think like we're all 19th century labour movement people. It needs a new language, even if that's one of them. Like, I don't want to refuse it or criticise it, those are my people. So what would new forms of organisation now be? That prolet cult is a precursor story, but we wouldn't do it like that. Bogdanov's trying to organise a lot of workers who probably couldn't read or did not read at a very sophisticated level and read different languages. Russia's an empire. Yeah? Hundreds of thousands of people joined prolet cult. It was a mass movement. Yeah. Maybe they did it because you got food and there was heat. We don't know. Like, there's complicated versions of the history.
It arrived even in Latin America.
Yeah.
In a drama.
And it turns out, actually, prolet cult was very influential around the place. Maybe Gramsci got things from it.
Yes, of course.
Early English Marxists were very influenced by it. So let's dig out that neglected strand. It wouldn't quite be the same thing, but wherever you see people trying to organise knowledge and practice around an agenda that's not driven by the academy itself, but is driven by the real world. It's not driven by the market either, so we're not doing TED Talks, and we're not doing, I have a slightly different interpretation of Walter Benjamin. Right, we're doing, it's a freaking Anthropocene. Let's organise knowledge. Like, that's where we're starting. So Anthropocene here at House of World Culture and its collaborators, that to me is a wonderful example. Yeah, what Haraway and her colleagues did with the history of consciousness, going back to the 70s, like, that's a model. So let's start looking for those other models.
And which will be the role of intellectuals?
I think I'm getting the wind up here.
Okay, maybe next.
Role intellectuals, that's the new book, that's General Intellects. But yeah, well, we'll come back and talk about that another time. I want to give the audience a shot at anyone have thoughts or questions out there. Yes, I have a person waving over here.
Diana here, haunting you from
Hey Diana, how are you?
the past. Yeah. Thanks so much. I need the both of you to sort of address a couple of very urgent problems that I don't know if they're from the past or the future. So let's go with, let's say, the novel What Is to Be Done, not the Lenin's the novel.
Yeah.
How that maybe has an influence on the Gurian Republic.
Sorry, on
the Gurian Republic, and how that Gurian Republic actually then inspires Bogdanov's writing of Red Star, because I think there's no way to disassociate them. How those things then influence the socialist project of cybernetics with the Cybersyn project, and for example, how those like the political crisis in the Soviet Union also basically is the ground of soil science, or what has become agronomy, and how that gets manifested in different African liberation struggles. So that, because those are things where there's very direct relationships and impacts and so on. And I think, because that's like time traveling stuff. So could you guys connect some dots?
Yeah,
there?
there's and it's like, I don't want to say no, these are the things that matter in this story, not these other things. There's always ways you can unpack the story differently. So I read a paper of Giulia's that does Avenarius and Bogdanov, and I was thinking, oh, this actually makes more sense. I did it with Mark because I want to tell a California story, and Feyerabend is a great interpreter of Mark. So I didn't do Avenarius, but it's like, oh, your version makes more sense. I kind of like,
no, well, it was. I mean, Bogdanov was inspired by both of them.
By both. That's the thing.
I mean,
I made an aesthetic choice, is what I'm saying. It's like, oh, I'm going to tell it this way because I'm creating a book that's like a novel. It's got an arc and it's got a pattern. But you're right. Chernyshevsky's an influence on everybody. It's not a book I personally like all that much. It seems a little ascetic and austere for me, so I didn't, and it's a huge influence on that whole generation of Russian revolutionaries. It's like really there in the background.
Okay, what I mean specifically, and both in Red Star and What Is to Be Done, they actually do have kind of like hand guide. They have like how-tos. They have entire sections that are basically how to build a revolutionary state. And so that's sort of what I mean, like, because those things kind of, it's like, they would be blogs now, I guess.
Yeah, and it has to be said, the literary merit of Bogdanov's novels is questionable, but they're written for a popular audience. Like they're popular entertainment, they're widely read. The prequel to Red Star is probably even more important because it's how to have the revolution, and it's actually kind of interestingly prescient in lots of ways. So yeah, they really still repay reading for lots of different reasons. The one thing about the Engineer Many is questions of class alliance. So it's like an engineer-worker alliance. I think that's so contemporary, yeah? I had lots of debates about the science march, where people are like, no, I'm not marching for science. Haven't we been against science for the past? We've been critiquing science for 30 years. And it's like, we've been critiquing science within the space of knowledge, and we should continue to do so. In the larger political space, when scientists are under attack, so are we. So can we think tactically about our relation? So it seems to me, and sometimes I'm thinking, you should read this book by Bogdanov from 1911 or whatever, about alliances with other classes who have different languages. So yeah, there's other histories you could tell about where Bogdanov comes from. There are particular things I wanted to draw out. Part of its aesthetic choices. What Is to Be Done really is not my thing because it's just so kind of ascetic. And I'm from that version where, I don't want your revolution if I can't take ecstasy. Like, that was how we rolled in the 80s, right? So, like, Chernyshevsky's just not like that whole, like, ascetic, and it's where Lenin gets that whole ascetic sort of thing from. Not my style, like what we would have called the sad militants from Deleuze and Guattari. Nah, can't go there. But if that's your thing, and I'm no judgments, right? Then by all means read that literature and follow that line. The other piece is agronomy, and I'm interested in Marx's relation to von Liebig, because that's where, like the Marxist term for Anthropocene is metabolic rift, right? Marx has already almost got it. So that strikes me as interesting, to start thinking, before we even get to industrial capitalism, we've really got to think the landlord system and the commodification of agriculture. Like, Marx kind of skips over that a little bit, like he knows he has to fill it in, never gets around to it. It's where also Ricardo, like, as I mentioned, worth reading, because that's the class struggle, is between different ruling classes. We need to know how to think that. And I really, really wanted to do something about Vavilov, but he didn't end up in the book. Because Vavilov is the great tragic story. And he was a bioprospector, among other things, possibly biopirate, traveling the world looking for seed stocks. Like, really incredible work of like, that he knew would take generations, right? To improve Soviet agriculture would take generations, because the experiments on different seed varieties would take that long. And, like, it's too big a story to shorthand, but like, Stalin is like, no, and this poor fellow suffers in jail and dies there, and his Marxist scientific colleagues around the world really did not do enough for the Vavilov case. So yeah, like that, this is a really key part of the story, and I would have loved to have written something about it. There was a great book, I can't remember the title, that someone follows in the footsteps of Vavilov around the world to see what seed varieties people are using, and it's already about how people are moving which varieties work where across different biomes because of climate change. It's got a more romantic, like, hippie version of seed stocks and so forth, which maybe is appropriate to go to. But that's a whole huge question that we didn't get into.
And you could be very much interested in the work of Sergei Podolinsky that we just mentioned about energy distribution and the Earth seen as a complex system that actually reacts as a kind of a cybernetic interpretation of the Earth. It was also related to Marx's theory of labor. He actually corresponded with Marx, and Marx replied to him. We found this document in the archive in Moscow, and Marx said, "Yeah, of course, I actually should revise my theory of labor according with what you are saying." I mean, he was like 20 years old physician from Ukraine, and that is such an honor.
Microphone is moving.
Brilliant lecture. It's triggering many thoughts. And I wanted to, maybe one of the really positive things that we're talking about here is the collaborative work. And so I want to elaborate on something about that. We have this alt-right version of denying the climate science and climate disruption. And I kind of see, I sort of got some insight in how the left is also sort of in denial of the techno-fascism around us. And I'm very concerned about how we are not looking at how to collaborate with a non-anthropocentric nature. So last month there was a conference of the Zapatistas and talking about how to use science for defending their position on the earth and indigenous people. And so kind of to try to get you to look at it from that framework, is there a way that we can collaboratively work with a very intelligent kind of ecosystem around us, rather than thinking that we're going to completely let this one just, burn and we're working on a collapsed environmental situation, but rather really trying to work like the indigenous in a way that we can collaboratively work to repair the damage that corporate capitalism has done on the environment that we need to live on and with. So I see a little bit in your pushing the second nature aspects and the science to utilize it for us, the Anthropocene. But there's something here about the non-anthropocentric that we need to work with, I think, and I wonder if you could reflect on that.
Yeah, I have a long-standing interest in the question of the indigenous because I'm Australian, and one of the central questions in Australian cultural studies was the question of the indigenous. And the work of Eric Michaels was very influential on me. He actually took systems theory and information theory and applied it to anthropology in the 80s. It was kind of like mind-blowing stuff. So I'm interested in that, and there's like a double sense in which the indigenous comes back into play, and one has to do with the experience of the loss of a world. Which for many indigenous people is how they would report what has happened. That, what are you talking about? Your world is ending. You already ended ours. To paraphrase, right? So the emotional work of surviving the end of a world is something that one actually gets in indigenous art, indigenous narrative, indigenous philosophy. That's of interest. But the other piece of it is, well, actually, often those were land use practices that they worked often for very small populations, but worked over extremely long time periods. In Australia, that's very true. And it may be why some anthropologists say the oldest continually worshipped deity in the world is actually the river serpent, which is a kind of connecting story that's used up and down the centre of Australia. And there's, sort of rock carving evidence going back thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years for river serpent. So it's like, oh, well, you guys survived not anything as dramatic as the end of the Holocene, but some pretty extraordinary variations in world throughout that period, and that's worth paying attention to. I think the person who's organised that is Eduardo Viveros de Castro. apologies to Portuguese speakers that I can't pronounce that better, who did an event called the Thousand Names of Gaia, which is sort of very much about thinking not just multicultural, but multi-natures. How is it that if we sort of pluralize what worldviews are, then the categories I'm using here can be provincialized. We wouldn't just think about, I was trying to have a very open-ended concept of nature as that which labour encounters, but this is still very much a modern and possibly Western one. I don't know its boundaries, but I want to acknowledge that I'm offering a bounded concept, not a universal one. So I think that dialogue with Indigenous experience is really, really important. It's just really difficult to have because you're often talking about the least well-resourced people in terms of being able to do that, and is it necessarily other people's priority to be, talking to a bunch of white people about their problems? So yes, I want to highlight the centrality of the Indigenous question, 2 reasons why it matters, someone who I think is doing much better work on that than me, who's an actual ethnographer. Then the other piece was to do with collaboration is, like for Bogdanov, there's always like hybrids of how social labour, broadly speaking, is organised. It's always partly organised around authority. It's partly organised around exchange. But the one that gets, forgotten about, collaboration and cooperation. So are there ways of rethinking the classic stories that sort of highlights that element, brings that to the fore? And to extend it beyond Bogdanov a little bit, but I think it's a spirit he'd recognise, where collaboration can include the non-human. Yeah, so I think there's a capaciousness in the concept to be sort of extended into those directions. And one can connect it up to forms of labour today. I mean, a lot of digital work is like ridiculously collaborative. It just all passes through GitHub, Like GitHub is hacker class socialism. It's just A, it's privately owned, and B, no one would think of it in that language. But you don't write this stuff, you assemble it, yeah? Like your genius or your skill is being able to put the pieces together. Yeah? So there are ways, even I think very contemporary forms of labour, if that's what it still is, have forms of cooperation one can talk with and to. It's a question of threading them together.
So I had a different kind of question about collaborative labour and of organising work differently, which is you talked about perhaps having to change a lot of the structures and ideas that we have used in the past to think about changing the world because of the Anthropocene. I wondered, would that include changing the idea of disciplines or getting rid of the idea of disciplines? Is that a pre-Anthropocene concept that's doing more harm than good?
Yeah, I don't know. It might be timely to do a little investigation in the history of how disciplines were formed and what objective was supposed to organise them, and to what extent they fall victim to a kind of formalisation where it becomes like gamified. Yeah, it becomes a game space. The objective is to get good at the game of getting certain papers in certain journals and so on, where it sort of doesn't actually then connect to anything very much. And where no one discipline is more guilty of that than others. Although, because I sit on the college-wide tenure committee, it's always like, oh my God, you guys are idiots. You just you played the game well and that's tenure. But then it's like, oh, I think my guys do that too, So to sort of like not be, one has to be holistic in approaching that. Knowledge needs organising, and it really clearly needs forms of error correction. So the thing to avoid is that, we'll have no disciplines, anything goes. There's constrained situations within which Feyerabend's anarchy of knowledge works. Like there's a constraint within which that then becomes something that works. And we sort of lose sight of that part of it a little bit. And that's so important in a world that's full of like climate deniers and people still being paid to say that smoking's not bad for you. People who think vaccination is a bad thing because they read about it on the internet. So, to not have the critique of the limits of science, like science, any form of knowledge ought to understand it's limited, it needs a certain modesty. But to not sort of flip from that to, all right, then I'll just believe any old random thing anywhere. Like the whole point of enlightenment in that sense was, error correction, noise reduction. So what are those processes? And they're not all modern. It connects back to the indigenous story. There are anthropologists who think that Australian Indigenous people have successfully told stories that are more or less true over thousands of years through oral communication, but it's got to do with a structure of error correction. In some Western desert societies, they're divided in half, and where if you're in charge of a story for one half of it, the person who corresponds to you from the other half validates whether you got it right or not. So you're not the authority, right? The authority is shared between someone who has the power to say, you got this bit wrong. This is not what this is or means. So we have reports of things that happened when the landscape was different, and scientific geological knowledge can confirm that where they're saying, there was water hundreds of miles inland, there really was. So it's like, it's not only, the Enlightenment that knows how to do error correction and noise reduction, there are other forms of knowledge that do it. But separating those two thoughts is really hard. Like, we like to think we've got a monopoly on correct knowledge, yeah? But maybe we don't. Like, maybe it becomes too highly formalized. Maybe it got attacked by certain kinds of parasitism, like these sort of pseudo-foundations in the United States that are there to provide knowledge about anything that rich people think would be handy to be true. So the struggle around the organisation of knowledge turns out, I think, to be really central to whatever the Anthropocene is about.
Hello, hi.
Hi.
Thank you for your talk. I had a question about what you said in response to the question before last about defining nature as that which labor encounters, because I was curious about that throughout your whole talk. If you could explain that a bit more, because what is the interest in delineating the territory of nature as such and pitting it against nature, labor, or separating it from labor, and how can that hold without feeding into the same invincible process of commodifying everything? Because it seems to me that this whole process of commodification depends on that idea somehow. I don't know. So I'm wondering what you think about this.
Yeah, I'm resistant to the thought that the problem with the West is that it had an idea of what nature is, and everything comes from the problem with an idea. Because the West always had several different competing and incompatible ideas about what nature is. In German, I don't know. In English, Raymond Williams says nature is one of the 2 or 3 most complicated words in the language, because it means both that which is not human, but it also means something that includes the human. So one really has to think the poetics of something that's several different things at once. And if one wants to say that, for example, the problem with the West is Descartes, then what about Spinoza, for whom nature is kind of like the opposite to what it is in Descartes, So there's like a field within which terms operate, partly logically, but partly through the non-logic but structure of language itself. So one would have to kind of think it through that. So I wanted a kind of restricted concept of nature. In the background of this is I've kind of went the other way to Timothy Morton. Like, Tim's thought is ecology without nature. I think ecology is more problematic, so I want to do nature without ecology, because I think there's an assumption built into ecology about homeostasis, and our problem is a lack of it. So, all right, how do we think nature where one doesn't try to attribute a quality to it in advance? Because our habit is to overcode it with whatever we think is natural about social organisation. So in the pre-capitalist West, nature is often surprisingly feudal in its organisation, and later it becomes about exchange. And in the Greeks it was always both, right? Because the Greeks were always a trading culture. And nature seems quite naturally to include the category of slavery, because many Western societies were slave owning and think it's cool to think that is a thing that's in the world. So it's tricky. So hence the formal definition. Now, all right, given, doing this puts a lot of weight on the category of labour. And in the second half of the book, I complicate that. But in the first half, all right, labour. Nature is what labour encounters. So it doesn't say what it is that labour encounters. It just says it encounters it. And if there's another key word in Bogdanov, it's resistant. Yeah? So labour encounters nature, but nature pushes back. And it's actually where Platonov's interesting, because in Platonov, it really pushes back. It pushes back to the point of disorganizing you. But this is the first thought. So the second thought is, all right, so if nature is what labour encounters, what labour will think nature is determined by the form of labour itself. So the form of the organisation of labour then starts to give you an image or a model of what you think nature is. That's going to be, and this is the third thought, it's going to be partly true because it works, but it's going to be partly not true because it's a metaphor that you've imported from a labour process. So that's the three bits of it. To think that nature is hierarchically organised, it's partly true. But it's partly you came out of a hierarchically organised society. That's what you think it is. Like Shakespeare's full of this stuff, yeah? You think that nature is a form of competitive exchange. The Greeks are already thinking that because that's the kind of society they lived in. But it's a model that Darwin imports willy-nilly, yeah? It's like actually most of Darwin's work doesn't actually point to nature being a market. It's kind of much more interesting and complicated than that. But you can see how if you live at the peak of a English imperial market society, it's going to kind of creep in there, yeah? From Spencer. So, yeah, one wants to be a little careful. All of these metaphors partly work. They partly explain things. They're not wrong, but they're limiting. So to think nature is this kind of like placeholder concept that's formal, like it's a concept I'm trying to get to work in a formal structure. So it at least avoids the problems I've outlined in those three parts. But as I think I've gestured elsewhere, it's still got some other issues. This is, I'm from a Western settler society that predisposes me to think nature in a certain way. I come from a weird peripheral one, so I certainly do not think nature is stable and homeostatic, because in Australia nature just isn't. So it's like, there's no freaking ecology, yeah? It's like, we have two relations to nature where I come from. It's either flood or drought. Like there's no mean, there's no average in between. And those are randomly distributed, yeah? And it's not the only part of the world that thinks about nature that way, yeah? So to have like a plural dialogue about this word that's extremely common in European languages and with its cognates in others, but where we think about it formally and not try to say too much about it. And it's where Anthropocene is a really useful circuit breaker, because you start to call it something else. And you start to think it in terms of a pivot or change in geological time. That then gives you extra leverage on all of those categories, on nature, on environment. Environment's got other problems. Let's not even get into that. Ecology. So we can think those in relation to the Anthropocene without trying to make any one of them a kind of ultra-true dominant category. Sorry that's a little long-winded, but it's kind of like the hardest thing to figure out, I think. Was for me.
I'm sorry, but we have time for one very short question and one very short answer.
Yeah, sorry the answers are long, but they're great questions, and the answers they're kind of like,
Hey, thanks for the talk. So you talked about the changing nature of the commodity form and the changing nature of labor. What do you think about the ruling class and how our idea of that and our definition of that might need to adapt?
Yeah, and I could give a long answer, but I'm not going to be allowed to. It's useful to not always use Marxist Das Kapital as the model, because it's like an ideal type that only has two classes. Like Marx's political writings are much more useful because they're multi-class negotiations. Gramsci picks up on that. Actual social democrats, like, you know, are all about that. So much of German social democracy is all about the peasant question, yeah? We don't have peasants, so we don't read that stuff, but they're like trying to think a multi-class world, and how can Labour be allied with peasants when they're different? Like, it's not the multitude that's all, it's different. They have different interests, different worldviews, different agendas. So, part of that is that ruling classes are also multiple. What if there was more than one ruling class? One of which is still based in extracting rent from land. It's just we don't strike it in its classic form of like the English aristocracy or the German Junker. We now encounter it in the form of these giant property trusts that own our cities and are driving up your rents. Yeah, so there's a way in which rent extraction is, in the classical sense, is still one of the central things. It's different. Rent is different from profit. Yeah, Ricardo's right about this. The reason owning property is such a good thing to be in is you can't magically make more of it. Yeah, it's fixed. It's limited. So the rent will go up as demand goes up, and supply will not match it. Different to profit. So there was already in classical political economy 2 ruling classes. What if there's a third? What if there's a new one? And what it owns and controls is not property. It's not the physical plan and infrastructure of the means of industrial production. It's the information. What if you could control the whole value chain just by controlling the information? You'd be surprised at the range of companies that have placed a bet on that. Like you sort of think, oh yeah, that's Google's play, or that's Apple. It's also Walmart, yeah? Walmart is all about logistics. Everything else is just based on a logistical model. Their data centers are as big as their supermarkets, yeah? A lot of the brands we see on products, like they own the brand, they don't make the product. You outsource to some capitalist somewhere the job of making it. You just control it through the information. That includes the brands, the trade dress, the patents, the copyrights, perhaps more importantly, the logistics of how all of that information is threaded together. So what if there was like I called it the vectorless class. You control a vector, like it's how information moves and can act in the world. And you get access to the information in aggregate that you're denying even to your clients. Yeah? And we all know Google runs basically by selling advertising, but they don't let those people know what they know. Yeah? So that would be the new ruling class, or a fraction or faction thereof. And its relative weight in different political economies might vary. It's perhaps less dominant in the German case. Like this is like still a country that seems to be based on controlling certain kinds of scientific and engineering-based manufacturing and being world leaders in that, and creating a relationship to a periphery where it maintains its dominance, right? And you know, the way to figure this out is look at countries' exports, yeah? In the United States, it's all financial services, military. You still have to build the stuff, but military is so much about the information that runs and controls it. And Hollywood, yeah, like that's all we export to the world, and some like random manufactured things. So yeah, what if there was a new kind of ruling class? It's not necessarily dominant because it's in conflict with these other ones. One is rent extracting, one is still actually physically making things. But how do they form coalitions and alliances? Are there ways you can drive a wedge between them? How does the dominance of vectorless class change what kinds of consensus political economy you end up with? Is it because it's a new kind of ruling class that is really super interested in commodifying the information-based aspects of what the social state used to do better? Yeah? Like, we know this. Socialized medicine, it's not perfect, but it works better. Socialized education is not perfect, but it works better. We know this. That's what the 20th century built. But the game now is, well, we don't care if these new versions work less well, and they really do. Let's commodify all of that. That's what's going on in the United States. I think it's going to happen here eventually, yeah. So it's like, oh, sending these kids from, terribly broken up homes who have no food to public schools means the public schools are failing. It's like, no, they're not. They're doing this awesome job with people whose lives you've tried to destroy every other way. But now we have to destroy their schooling as well. Or let's commodify higher education. Already happened to the sciences in the United States when universities could own and control the intellectual property that the university generates. That's the new university, right? And places like Stanford become players where they never were before. So, in short, what if there is a new kind of ruling class? The old ones didn't go away, they're still there. What if there are new forms of subordinate class? What does it mean to sell information rather than physical labour? There's still peasants in the world, there's still industrial labour, but maybe the diagram of class forces is more complicated than it used to be, and I would need to think about new languages, new alliances. Everything's not always new, right? Sometimes the languages can be old that one will use to make this work, but one has to kind of think politics in the present. All right, now I'm getting the wind up, right? Thank you for the awesome questions. I'm sorry they took a little bit of elaborating to get the whole piece of it.
There is still sun outside, I guess. Yeah. Thank you so much. It was so rich and inspiring, and we will be thinking about that for days.
Thank you, Giulia.
Please joining me thanking again Professor McKenzie Wark.